Hi everybody, I'm going to be doing a short theoretical one today on something that I think is the biggest hurdle to jump when you're first learning Volt, and that is the topic of promise objects and how they work. If you haven't worked with promises before, they might seem a little bit strange, but as you'll soon see, they offer a number of performance and maintenance benefits to Volt and Opal users, and they're pretty nice to work with once you get a hang of them. Ruby users are often accustomed to code that runs synchronously. For example, if you make a call to the database in Mongoid or Active Record, you might expect the process to sit there until the database responds. And then once that occurs, the process continues normal execution. That's not how Volt handles things, though. In Volt, database queries on the front end are non-blocking. This means that the program will continue execution while the database query finishes returning its data. Volt and Opal both piggyback on the JavaScript event loop. This provides a performance boost over synchronous I/O operations, but it does come with some mental overhead. Your code can do other things while waiting for the data to come back from the server, but this comes at the price of not knowing the order in which your responses are going to come back. And this is where promises come in to help you keep things organized. So let's go back to the database query that I showed in the beginning of the screencast. As we now know, the call to .where is not returning a model, but rather a promise object that's going to wrap around that model at some point in the future once it has access to the model. Once the database and network respond to the request, Volt will execute the block that got passed into .then. It's important to remember that all database operations in Volt return a promise. So that brings me to the next topic of chaining promises. So we now know that when we make a database request that we're not going to get back a model, but rather we're going to get a promise object that will return a model at some point in the future. Sometimes you need to call a promise that returns another promise, and so on. And when you're dealing with numerous promises that return promises, you can keep the repetition to a minimum by chaining calls to .then, as you see here. This is useful for situations when you're depending on data from a previous request. In this example, we're performing two interdependent database queries, and we don't want to send the second request until we have data from the first request. So in essence, you're telling Volt to delay execution, but you're not slowing down other parts of the app. Chaining promises that return promises keeps things pretty readable because you can just call .then repeatedly instead of putting things into a big pyramid of doom, so to speak. The example that you see on the right is something that you'll see a lot of beginning Volt users make, but actually it's not necessary. You could just call .then on the first promise and it will maintain the order of execution once all of the promises resolved. Now what would we do though if we just had a bunch of database requests that weren't dependent on each other, but just needed to happen around the same time? If you have multiple unrelated promises, you can call Promise.when to execute all of the requests in parallel. This is faster than chaining promises because they don't rely on each other, but it does not allow you to reference previous requests since the order of completion can't be guaranteed. An example like this one might be useful when you've got things like a request that is dependent on two unrelated subqueries and you need to mix the data together when it gets returned from the database. Now, you'll notice in the previous examples we've been calling .then quite a bit, and this can get a bit repetitive, so luckily Volt provides a convenient workaround. So as you see here in the official documentation, it is possible to just call a method directly on a promise object and then have that method get called on the model later on when the promise resolves. And that's a great way to dry up your code and not call .then so many times. But you might be wondering, why would we even bother calling .then if we can just use method forwarding? Well, there's actually two common use cases where method forwarding isn't going to work and you still need to call .then directly. The first mistake a lot of people make when dealing with promise objects is trying to perform comparisons directly on a promise, thinking that the comparison is going to get forwarded to the object when it resolves. And unfortunately, it's not possible to use comparison operators directly on a promise object. you're going to have to call .then if you want to compare a promise's return value. And this is true for any method that's not alphanumeric. A second common mistake is trying to call a method that is implemented on the promise and on the model. For instance, if you wanted to serialize the results of a database query, you might try calling .toJSON on the promise object, and since that method is already defined on the promise class itself, it's going to serialize the promise object instead of its return value, which is almost never what you want to be doing, or never what the intention was. I hope that clears up any confusion surrounding promise objects in Volt. If you're still unsure about something, let me know in the comment section of the blog. And also, if you've enjoyed today's article, consider signing up for Premium, where I cover more advanced topics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.